As a consequence, I ran smack into the first bottleneck 90 minutes after moving beyond the balcony at 28,000 feet, where the intermingled teams encountered a series of massive rock steps that required ropes for safe passage. Clients huddled restlessly at the base of the rock for nearly an hour while Beidelman, taking over the duties of an absent Lopsang, laboriously ran the rope out. Here, the impatience and technical inexperience of Hall's client Yasuko Namba nearly caused a disaster. An accomplished businesswoman employed by Federal Express in Tokyo, Yasuko didn't fit the meek, deferential stereotype of a middle-aged Japanese woman. At home, she told me with a laugh, her husband did all the cooking and cleaning. Her quest for Everest had turned into a minor cause célèbre in Japan. Previously on the expedition, she'd been a slow, uncertain climber, but today, with the summit in her crosshairs, she was energized as never before. From the time we arrived at the South Col, says John Taskey, who'd shared a tent with her at Camp 4, Yasuko was totally focused on the top. It was almost like she was in a trance. Ever since leaving the call, she'd been pushing extremely hard, jostling her way toward the front of the line. Now, as Beidelman clung precariously to the rock 100 feet above the clients, the overly eager Yasuko clambered Jumar to the dangling rope before the guide had anchored his end of it. As she was about to put her full body weight on the rope, which would have pulled Beidelman off, Mike Groom intervened in the nick of time and gently scolded her for being so impatient. The traffic jam at the ropes grew with each arriving climber, so those at the rear of the scrum fell farther and farther behind. By late morning, 3 of Hall's clients, Stuart Hutchison, John Taskey, and Lou Kasich, climbing near the back with Hall, were becoming quite worried about the lagging pace. Immediately in front of them was a Taiwanese team, moving especially sluggishly. They were climbing in a peculiar style, really close together, says Hutchison, almost like slices in a loaf of bread, one behind the other, which meant it was nearly impossible to pass them. We spent a lot of time waiting for them to move up the ropes. At base camp before our summit bid, Hall had contemplated 2 possible turnaround times, either 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. He never declared which of these times we were to abide by. However, which was curious, considering how much he'd talked about the importance of designating a hard deadline and sticking to it no matter what. We were simply left with a vaguely articulated understanding that Hall would withhold making a final decision until summit day, after assessing the weather and other factors, and would then personally take responsibility for turning everyone around at the proper hour. By mid-morning on May 10th, Hall still hadn't announced what our turnaround time would actually be. Hutchison, conservative by nature, was operating on the assumption that it would be 1 p.m. Around 11 a.m., Hall told Hutchison and Taskey that the top was still 3 hours away, and then he sprinted to try and get past the Taiwanese. It seemed increasingly unlikely that we would have any chance of summiting before the 1 p.m. turnaround time, says Hutchison. A brief discussion ensued. Kasich was initially reluctant to concede defeat, but Taskey and Hutchison were persuasive. At 11:30, the 3 men turned their backs on the summit and headed down, and Hall sent Sherpas Kami and Lakpachiri down with them. Electing to descend must have been supremely difficult for these 3 clients, as well as for Frank Fishbeck, who'd turned around hours earlier. Mountaineering tends to draw men and women not easily deflected from their goals. By this late stage in the expedition, we had all been subjected to levels of misery and peril that would have sent more balanced individuals packing for home long ago. To get this far, one had to have an uncommonly obdurate personality. Unfortunately, the sort of individual who is programmed to ignore personal distress and keep pushing for the top is frequently programmed to disregard signs of grave and imminent danger as well. This forms another dilemma that every Everest climber eventually comes up against. In order to succeed, you must be exceedingly driven, but if you're too driven, you're likely to die. Above 26,000 feet, moreover, the line between appropriate zeal and reckless summit fever becomes grievously thin. Thus the slopes of Everest are littered with corpses. Taskey, Hutchison, Kasich, and Fishbeck had each spent as much as $70,000 and endured weeks of agony to be granted this one shot at the summit. All were ambitious men, unaccustomed to losing and even less to quitting. And yet, faced with a tough decision, they were among the few who made the right choice that day. Above the rock step where John, Stuart, and Lou turned around, the fixed ropes ended. From this point, the route angled steeply upward along a graceful arête of wind-compacted snow that culminated in the south summit, where I arrived at 11 a.m. to find a second, even worse bottleneck. A little higher, seemingly no more than a stone's throw away, was a vertical gash of the Hillary step, and slightly beyond at the summit itself. Rendered dumb with awe and fatigue, I took some photos, then sat down with guides Andy Harris, Neil Beidelman, and Anatoly Bukreev to wait for the Sherpas to fix ropes along the spectacularly corniced summit ridge. I noticed that Bukreev, like Lobsang, wasn't using supplemental oxygen. Although the Russian had summited Everest twice before without gas, and Lobsang thrice, I was surprised Fisher had given him permission to guide the peak without it, which didn't seem to be in their client's best interest. I was also surprised to see that Bukreev didn't have a backpack. Customarily, a guide would carry a pack containing rope, first aid supplies, crevasse rescue gear, extra clothing, and other items necessary to assist clients in the event of an emergency. Bukreev was the first guide I'd ever seen on any mountain ignore this convention.